So hello, good evening everyone, and welcome once again to the Public Policy Special Interest Group, IIMA's Special Interest Group webinar series, our flagship webinar series today as well. Today we are going to speak about transformation in the education policy, especially in the context of COVID-19. And we have with us two eminent panelists, Mr. Ashish Dhawan, and Ms. Meeta Sengupta, who have kindly agreed to join us for a dialogue, trying to dissect and go deeper into some of the interesting issues that are coming up as the sector is evolving, as the pandemic is sort of slowly fading away. It is leaving an imprint in all the sectors, and education sector is definitely one of the areas which has been deeply impacted. Along with that, we also have a national education policy which is being rolled out. Both our panelists have tremendous experience working in the area of education in India, both as thought leaders and also as practitioners. Ashish Dhawan, he's a founder and CEO of Central Square Foundation and the Ashoka University. Mr. Dhawan is an Indian private equity investor and a philanthropist who was also recognized as the next-gen leader in philanthropy by Forbes India for his charitable work in 2012. That's right, Dhawan, right? Ashish, right? 2012, that's right, yeah. And we will have Ms. Meeta Sengupta. She's a PGP 94 batch alumnus of IIMA. She will be in conversation with Ashish. She's been in the education strategy space for quite some time. She's a prolific writer, advisor. She's also the founder of the Center for Education Strategy, a Delhi-based think tank that builds, according to her, bridges between policy and practice for educators, educationals, and institutions. So I don't think we could have a better combination of panelists today for discussing about the unfolding scenario in the Indian education sector in this context. So what we're going to do today is, the structure, the format of the webinar is going to be, again, very free-flowing as it has been always in this webinar series. I will hand over the platform to Mr. Dhawan. He will make a short introduction about himself, give us a few seeding thoughts to start the conversation, and then over to you. It will be Meeta and Ashish into a conversation. I will jump in as and when something interesting pops up, or I feel like provoking the panelists with something worth considering for the audience. So. Once again, welcome to the webinar. As we all are quite proud of. It's a webinar where we not only have a prominent panelists, we also have the who's who of the country among the audience. So it's considered very serious, and we take the entire exercise with a pinch of seriousness. We take note of all this, of all the conversations, and then we circulate among everyone. So with that, once again, thank you very much to all of you. And let me hand over the platform to Mr. Dhawan. Ashish, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anish. Thank you so much. So it's just an honor to be part of this. Thank you, Meeta, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I thought I'll tell you a little bit about my background, why I got into education, and then we can focus on the COVID period and particularly the new education policy, where I know there's a lot of interest. So I as you mentioned, Anish, I'm actually a business school graduate myself. I had worked in finance, and then I eventually started a private equity fund called Chris Capital 21 years ago. I'm a hardcore investor. I love investing. It was my passion. Still love it, but unfortunately, it was not my only love. And so I had always been thinking about this idea of having multiple careers and at least a second, if not a third. And the idea of doing something outside of the corporate sector appealed to me, taking on a tough challenge and working on it along with others for a long period of time. education is a bug that had been in me for a long time. I had wanted to be a teacher when I was a high school student, and that dream never was fulfilled. But as I was in my private equity career, on the side, I was giving a little bit of money. I started reading about the education crisis in India. I would go out in the field occasionally on a Saturday to see what was happening. And I became interested that this was really a fundamental issue that we're faced with. And, it would become an important part of my life's work going forward. So when I was 43 years old, which is about 8 years ago, I transitioned out of the corporate sector and started Central Square Foundation. A couple of years prior to that, we had started Ashoka University as well. So really this last decade has been about focusing on education in particular. If we step back and look at the work we do at Central Square Foundation, it's very much focused on system reform. And if you look at the overall system, we have 250 million children who go to school, class 1 through 12. There are additionally another 50 plus million children who are in the earlier grades, preschool, and then another 35 million who are in higher education. We at Central Square Foundation don't look at higher education, but I'm happy to talk about that in the context of NEP. As all of you know, if you've looked at the ASA report, which Pratham puts out, we've had a learning crisis for a long period of time. So India did a great job, in the post-colonial era of massifying education. We had a low literacy rate. It was in the sort of teens when the British left, and we were able to ensure that people were attending school, so much so that now we've almost universalized elementary education. So primary up to class 5 and almost universal up to class 8. And then there's a drop-off thereafter. But if you look at learning, I think what the ASA report shows is that 70% of children can't read second grade text by the end of third grade. The NAS, which is the National Achievement Survey, which is the government's own survey, is a little bit more generous and says that around 40+% of children don't get there. But if you take sort of some place in the middle, roughly more than half our children. In fact, the World Bank has put out a report called the Learning Poverty Report. It says that we have 55% learning poverty in India. So this is really the challenge that we're faced with. The learning breaks down early, and thereafter, children can't catch up. COVID is a body blow to education because while state governments and private schools are scrambling to get their act together, we know that whilst in upper middle class homes, our kids were able to take care of them, spend time with them, they're doing Zoom classes. It's not the same, but with parental support, they're still continuing. But for India 2 and India 3, which is 75% of India or 80% of India, quite frankly, those children are being left behind. So, but what's happening in the wake of COVID is we know there's more connect between the teacher and the parent. The teachers are becoming more familiar with using technology tools, setting up WhatsApp groups. They're more comfortable taking an online course, etc. So whilst this year is going to be a write-off, I think there'll be some plumbing infrastructure that will be built in terms of integrating technology into the teaching learning process thereafter. Now, the biggest thing that's happened of late is the national education policy. And we'll talk about that in a bit, but I just want to frame it by saying that, it is truly a game changer. It's a historic policy. The last one, as you know, came out 34 years ago. This will live for at least another 20 years. And there are some salient points in there, both with regards to school education and higher education. I think with school education, what I care about most is that we've recognized that learning breaks down early. And so there's an undue emphasis on early childhood education, but particularly on foundational numeracy and literacy, which is being put into mission mode. It's the only thing in the policy where it's very, very concrete in terms of what needs to get done. And it clearly says that without this, nothing else matters. And that by 2025, we need to have made significant progress. So I think that's good news. And there are a number of things within the NEP which don't require extra resources. But there are a number of things that are pointed out in the NEP that I think are a pipe dream. And then with regards to higher education, what I'm most excited about is the fact that the NEP talks about shifting all of Indian higher education in the direction of multidisciplinary and holistic education. We set up Ashoka University with that purpose, really to build a liberal arts and sciences university that's about breadth and depth, 21st century skills. And our goal was always, Sanjeev Bhikchandani, who's an IIMA alum, always used to say, you know, what the IIMs did for was really made management education prestigious. And the IITs did that for engineering. And Ashoka's raison d'etre is to push the system in the direction of multidisciplinary, holistic, broad, liberal arts kind of education. And so we are just delighted that that's the direction the NEP is pushing the whole higher education system in. So I'll just quickly stop there and, you know, we can make it more of a conversation.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashish. You've covered the broad ground of what is happening currently, and that therefore gives me the opportunity to drill deep into a few of these aspects. So I'm going to start by actually asking you some bigger questions, systemic questions about education. And in the second half of our conversation, what I'm hoping to do is talk a little bit more about the personal journeys in policy making and how we as management professionals and management students can engage with the process of policy making. Both parts actually interconnected, obviously. The first big picture talking about how the system works, and the second part about how engagement with the system works as an individual. But I'm glad you started and definitely mentioned the COVID crisis, the big thing that is happening. This is, I'm now fond of saying that COVID has come to us as a catalyst, because I remember attending sessions where you brought in wonderful examples of blended learning and brought the owners of those enterprises who were running blended learning academies that were running blended learning processes and demonstrated the value of that to education, the education community, the policy community. I remember that. So this advocacy, the demonstration, the evidence building for learning in the digital space or engaging the digital space and the pedagogical space together has been something that we've been talking about for the longest time. But schools in general have been resistant to it. And had they invested 15 years ago, had they invested 10 years ago, we would not be scrambling the way we are today. And for those of us who've been in this area for long, it feels like a bit of a letdown when we see them running roll calls and running 40-minute sessions and expecting lecture mode to work in their right now. Digital pedagogy should have evolved a lot more. Absolutely has come as a crisis, but it's also come as a catalyst. So I actually want to hear a little bit more about where, and parts of it are going right, as you said, the mechanics of it. But the pedagogy aspect of it, I personally am very worried. I'm very worried that we may be crystallizing bad habits while getting used to the mechanics.
I would call it, where, you know, in the high-end schools and with households that have bandwidth, it's teaching over Zoom, it's remote teaching. They're trying to replicate the physical online. Obviously, it's a very, very poor substitute because engaging children in that mode is very difficult. And frankly, the teachers are not prepared. They don't have an understanding or appreciation of the fact that it's a different sort of pedagogy, instructional mode that works in the online phase to keep kids engaged. My hope is that this is not obviously the future. Children will eventually go back to school. The real question is, how do we integrate technology into the teaching learning process? So my vision would be, if you look at it from the perspective of the teacher, student, and parent, let's break it down to that. I think from a teacher's perspective, I think what we should see in the not so distant future is that as a teacher gets ready to go to class, she can look at a video and get basically some curricular resources which will help her transact the classroom. And that's already available. We developed something with google.org called Tic Tac Learn. And it's basically maps out in math and science, essentially videos to explain concepts to children, but also to teachers. And there are many others like that. So in addition, she'll have a digital lesson plan, right? So she can prepare if she's in the Bombay, suburban train, comes in, she's got a lesson plan on her phone that'll help guide her. With lesson delivery, if she wants to show a video, make the learning more engaging, she has that tool in her hand as well, using the smartphone, using a projector, etc. And finally, she can potentially even assign homework digitally. I mean, this, of course, assumes that smartphones are ubiquitous. We're still 5 years away from that. So right now, it's not possible. And eventually, you can do assessment using technology as well, which is a far better way to do it. From a student's perspective, I think there's both exposure to technology at school and at home. Now, B2B in the government system, the challenge has been, there are a few challenges with the whole from a student perspective. We know what works really well is personalized adaptive learning, not something passive, not just a smart board where you play a video, etc. Because that's like broadcast TV. It's extremely passive, it's not engaging. And the challenge with B2B on the government side has been, whether it's procurement of hardware, unwillingness to pay for software, the availability of good pedagogically sound material in vernacular form, evidence as to whether it works or doesn't work, that kind of. So a lot of work still needs to be done on the digital side in terms of supply shaping and evidence building, and also figuring out how you can integrate this into the system and getting the system to actually pay for software, developing the technical standards. So we've been working with some states like Andhra Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh. The ministry actually sent out guidelines for this to happen. But I think this will be a journey over the next 5 years as the templates get developed, as the blue books start to get printed out. The B2C side has taken off much faster because, there you have parents have smartphones, you can get exposed to material. Right now, I think in India 3 at least, the bottom half of the socioeconomic pyramid, parents don't use their smartphone typically for educational purposes, more for social media and entertainment. Thanks to COVID, they've gotten used to the teachers sending something over WhatsApp, they're using it, they're going to see some YouTube videos that are educational sent by the teacher. They've been asked to download an app, etc. So I think there's great potential in B2C also to engage children with supplementary material that will be helpful to them. So I think that's from a student perspective. And then from a parent perspective, parents, particularly in India 3, were not engaged in their child's education. I think what technology does is it allows you, the teacher now has a connect with the parent. In the Anganwadi system or preschool system, teachers generally know the parents. Not true in the school system. There's not as much of a linkage. I think thanks to COVID, that linkage is being built. And my sense is technology will allow us to not only just, it's a communication in terms of what's happened in school, but because you'll be sending educational material, you'll be assessing, keeping parents in the loop. Parents will get more involved in the child's education as well. So that's my hope in terms of where we head in the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm. And just like listening to you, I realized something that is also disappointing. And that is the sheer number of years of work that has been put into making learning outcomes important in the education discussion, especially in the policy space. That's been a humongous effort to shift that needle. And now comes COVID. And I realized that for the time being, for the duration of COVID, and which could be at least another year, as you said, this year is written off. The only thing we can measure is inputs all over again. Yeah. And I'm just sharing this concern with you that holding the needle onto the outcome space will also become an imperative for us. That it's a battle that we thought we had won in a way. because
Yeah.
it is in the new education policy. But will it? But the reversion to the mean is something that we know typically happens in every marketplace, and this is as much a marketplace of ideas and delivery as any other. So I just wanted to also share this concern that it is possible that we will have to still continue to expend this effort given COVID.
Yeah.
NEP itself thankfully acknowledges the importance of outcomes. In fact, NEP has done so many wonderful things. And first, congratulations, because your team, CSF, I think specifically, has invested so much in getting foundational learning in mission mode. I think the only other time I see the word mission in that entire document, but not in big print, is when they talk about a mentoring mission as such, which is also an important aspect, but that's a whole other conversation. Mission mode actually is a technical term. Mission mode means you will work across ministries. Mission mode means budget approvals have a shorter process, etc. And so it must have been a process to get to firstly helping policymakers understand the importance of foundational learning, and secondly helping them actually enable it in mission mode, not just put it in policy. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the policy, but definitely would want to hear more about this journey of engaging with policy at this, and the importance of this foundational learning. And while we're talking about the NEP, I would love to hear what you think were the big misses. There were a few things that were definitely left out that we had hoped would be in the policy.
Yeah.
And where you are hopeful of things actually happening in addition to foundational learning.
Yeah. No, that's a lot. So let me first start with foundational learning. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think, it's a no-brainer that when you have a leaky pipe, you go upstream to fix it, right? So it's the same is true here. We know that learning breaks down early. I mentioned that by class 3 itself, children are falling behind. And class 3 is that critical year when children switch from learning to read to reading to learn. Right? If you cannot read, you cannot transact the curriculum in class 4, 5, 6 onwards. If you cannot do basic mathematical operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, you cannot do fractions in class 5. It's just not possible. You can't do algebra thereafter. So I think, what we had to do, this is obvious, but there's a lot of research literature around this from around the world. It's commonsensical as well. So we had to basically build a narrative around this over the last couple of years and build a lot of surround sound, much before NEP. And so it's looking at different audiences, Meeta. So firstly, for a general audience, we actually created a video and that got, 7-8 million views, and it was in Hindi. And we focused on building sort of surround sound more broadly. We worked a lot with the media, investing journalists and getting media, whether it's digital media, TV, print, etc., to be sending this message so that you build the surround sound and amplify the voice. We met with a number of politicians, including leaders within the BJP, etc., to make them aware. And the good news is because people understand this instinctively. You don't just have to quote research. People know कि अगर बच्चा पढ़ नहीं सकता है तो आगे कैसे बढ़ेगा. I mean, it's simple. You just have to say it like that and they understand it. So I think with every one of these target audiences, there's obviously a different way to pitch this. You have to identify who the right staking with the bureaucracy. The committee itself, which was drafting it, did excellent work. And I think the good news is many of them understood this very, very early on. And there were many others, by the way, who helped, because many countries around the world that had launched a mission, what they had done. So it was important not just to convince people of the why, it was important to convince people that it was possible. It was possible within a 2 to 5 year time frame, because no politician wants to wait forever on this. That within 2 years, you'll start to see lead indicators move. That means you may not get all children reading with comprehension, but right now, if children can't, 20% of children can't recognize letters, another 20% can't decode words, that those problems we can solve earlier. Those are lead indicators. And that over time, over 5 years, you can actually achieve the reading with meaning goal, over 3 to 5 years. So I think convincing people of that is very important. And then the how. what's a framework as to how this will happen, how much money, making people realize actually it doesn't require that much more money. The money is already there. You just have to reallocate it. And that it involves some degree of goal setting by the top, by the Prime Minister and others. It involves making some budgets available and some basic curricular resources, and then giving the states the ability to compete with each other, and having a monitoring framework and accountability there, and releasing some of the enabling conditions. So just being clear about the how, I think, was important to convince people. But I would say it's a lot of people who worked at it, and that's how it sort of got shaped. In terms of what the NEP doesn't have that maybe I would wish for, I think when it comes to private schools, we know that 47% of our children go to private schools. I think the NEP could have recognized that, a little bit more upfront, and possibly done more, given the fact that almost 1 out of every 2 children goes to private school. So that part, I think, and it's still got a little bit of this socialist connotation of these people are, crass commercial and hoodwinking people. And we know that's not necessarily true. I'm not saying that all private schools are great. I'm not saying private schools' results are that much better. But just recognizing the fact that 1 out of 2 go there. And therefore, what do we do? Because we want all children to learn. Whether I'm not a private school wala. I mean, I care about the children. Exactly. And so I think I would have liked to see more of that in the policy.
And also possibly PPP, because that's also proven to be quite successful. There was this massive shivir that was organized where private NGOs, etc., who had created successful pilot programs were invited to that. So I would have also liked to see more PPP. And I will talk about pilot programs and scaling. Actually, might as well right now plunge directly into that, because there are a lot of private, both schools and private civil society organizations, NGOs, wonderful examples of people we have met and many more we don't know, who've been doing excellent work in enabling learning outcomes to shift in different ways. Yeah. Some in tribal areas, some in the cities, some in the interiors. And many of them finally actually have evidence, because in the past decade, impact reports have become part of the funding cycle. So we have pilots, we have evidence. What we do not have is the ability to scale them up. And scaling has consistently been a core problem in our education space, specifically in the education space. Health seems to be easier to scale. But successful education pilots, possibly because they are so dependent on champions or the one passionate leader who led them in the beginning, and that passion and that leadership is not easy to replicate, or possibly for structural design reasons, we haven't seen humongous replication impact. And therefore we haven't seen scale. We haven't seen the McDonaldization, in a way, of all the good that has been created in the education space. And that remains something of a problem area for those of us who want to create both good and impact. So how do you sort of weave your way out of this wherever it has been successful?
Yeah, so I think excellent question. So firstly, I would say you're right. Education is a much more complex production function than, say, health. I mean, we all know how hard it is to get a child to read. I mean, for all of us who've had children, you know how much effort you personally put in to make that happen. And then for them to develop an interest in reading, a love for reading, is even harder, right?
And making it fun.
And making it fun. Yeah, that's what I mean. The joy of reading, so that you love it and you continue with it forever. We know how hard that is. And imagine the teacher's job then, because listening and speaking skills come naturally from the home and the mother tongue. But reading and writing are very, very difficult concepts. Even some mathematical concepts are quite abstract. I mean, you go from concrete to abstract, but they're difficult. Versus, vaccinating a child. I'm not trivializing it, but you can understand the difference in the production function. It's just so much more complicated, I think, the education. So it's quite complex. It's hard to turn the needle. I think you make a very good point that, look, NGOs have done a great job and in the last 10 years, we have evidence. We know that we can really turn the needle. I mean, I'll give you examples. Room to Read did a pilot in 4 districts, so almost district-wide. And they went from 6 words per minute reading fluency at the beginning of the year to, like, depending on the district, 25 to 28 words per minute, right, at the end of the year. This is in class 2. And the control group went to 12 words per minute. So stunning results. I mean, this is stunning, right? And there's another former IAS officer, Dheer Jingran, who runs something called LLF, again, doing stunning work in Haryana in terms of the improvement you've seen there. That's visible even in Asar now. Or Pratham, you know, if you look at their TRL and some of the results they've had out of school, even in the Balwadis and things like that, stunning, 0.5, 0.6 sigma improvement. I think the issue has been, how does the system adopt this? Because the problem is NGOs can't scale beyond a certain point, and NGO programs are not sustainable. Because as you said, you'll get another bureaucrat, it'll fizzle away, the funding will fizzle away, the donors will get tired, you know, etc. So I think the mistake we've made is NGOs have to play a different role. Their role is, one is to build evidence, like you were saying, but then the second is to be a technical partner to the system and really white label what they've done. So I you know, with Room to Read, for example, in Madhya Pradesh, we are working with them. In this one hard tribal district, they've shown these stunning results. And what we said to them is, instead of scaling your program, let's go to the state. We'll go talk to the chief minister. Let's roll out a program, but let's white label it. Let's call it Madhya Pradesh's program. And all your material gets white labeled and it becomes the state's material. But you have to be flexible. You've got to work with the SERT, spend 6 to 12 months. Your program will not translate 100%. They, you know, about 80% or 70% will come through because they will not adopt everything. They're not just going to do a cut paste, right? Because they have to own it. It has to be there. And then you act as more of the technical partner. You help build capacity in the system. You help quality assure the program. And often you need a project management unit who brings different skill sets, more in terms of holding the system accountable, helping them. So what we have learned is we need to move more towards system reform. And the NGO can play a great role in terms of not only building evidence, but then becoming this technical partner to work with them, to do the capacity building, to do some quality assurance on the ground, to ensure this is working. But you move from I do to we do to you do. I mean, that has to be the transition. So I'll give you the example in Madhya Pradesh. One district they did themselves. Now we are doing 3 districts in we do mode. Much lighter touch. The system owns it. Everything is private labeled. It's not Room to Read's program, it's the state's program. And then eventually it'll go to 51 districts where the state will drive it completely. The non-profit, ourselves, the PMU, all will still be around to help and assist and quality assure it, build capacity, be there, build the monitoring framework. So that, I think, is the mode that we need to switch into. And by the way, there's some very good examples globally around this. Peru is the most improved country on PISA. And in Peru, it was all system-led. The president of Peru got up and said, my children in class 2 need to be reading X words per minute and Y words per minute by class 3. Goal setting, every teacher, every parent knew it. The system owned it, the system drove it. Same thing in Kenya with the Tusome program, etc. So I think the good news is the NEP is doing this now. When it says mission mode, it means now the system will own it. The center is defining what the mission looks like, but each state will drive its own mission. And by the way, we should be very proud to hear that UP has already launched something called Mission Prerna, which the chief minister put his hand on the document and swore that he'll get every child to achieve foundational numeracy and literacy, and launch Mission Prerna. And we're supporting the state there. Or Gujarat has already been working on foundational numeracy literacy, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana. So some states have already been attempting this system reform work. And Michael Susan Dell Foundation has also been doing some good work with 3 or 4 states on this system reform idea. So I think this is the mode that we need to move into.
Which actually partially answers Anish, the professor's question on the federal and the state impact, not wholly, of course. And there was an audience question that came in as well about why foundational learning, or why there isn't much in the NEP about foundational learning and it's been left to the states. And I think you answered that broadly because the implementation lies with the states.
Correct.
And the more you decentralize the implementation, the better or stronger the sense of ownership. And therefore the impact on that. We'd also
there is an important role for the center though, because what the center is doing by putting it in mission node is giving it the visibility, right? from the top. It's also ensuring the budgets are available for all the material. A child can't read unless you have a print-rich environment in the classroom. You need certain basic level reader series, a small library, without which in most classrooms. So you need the money for that. You need a teacher guide if you're going to have structured pedagogy. So the basic money needs to be available for that. You need a monitoring framework, right, which the center needs to produce. So there's a bunch of things the center can do. And then really beyond that, the implementation is left to the states. But the center can also create some incentives for states and districts to compete with each other, as we've seen in Swachh Bharat or some other programs that went into mission mode.
Actually, you've talked money, and I have to ask you this question. It's something that bothers me. 6% of the GDP, in my opinion, is unlikely to happen. I know it's part of the NEP, etc. Unlikely to happen. Post-COVID, money is going to go towards health and public health as well, in terms of priorities. Education cannot, at least in the near term, remain. We have to admit to that. It can't remain a priority for funding. And it already, isn't. We're down to 2.5. Now, I have a hypothesis, a personal hypothesis over here, that we should be in a position, if we plan this and work this going forward, we should be in a position to enable digital to reduce that demand or that ask from 6% to a lower or more achievable monetary target. And I know this is a very, very large systemic question, but suppose we take that on as what needs to be done ahead, in addition to the other things that need to be done, and we will be discussing some of those and many of those. Do you think this is a sort of probable, possible, potential hypothesis to be working with? Should we be thinking this way?
Yeah, I would disagree with that, Meeta. I think I completely agree with you. The 6% is not going to happen. Just look at our tax to GDP ratio. We just don't, forget about COVID. We just don't have the fiscal space either which way to go to 6%, because it'll crowd out a whole bunch of other things. You can't just find the space. We're not going to cut defense expenditure to do education, etc. So it's not going to happen. Two is, if you look in aggregate, if you combine government and private, we're already at 5.8% of GDP, which is not far away from where most other countries are. Korea is an outlier at 8%, but if you leave that out, most countries that are performing are actually at around 6%. Right? What we forget is half the children are going to private school. So you need to take into account the private spend and look at it in aggregate. So in aggregate, I don't think it's a money problem. Right? And as I said, if you look at, say, foundational learning, I think we can achieve dramatic improvement with the current set of resources. We don't need to put more money, because India is already massified. We've increased the number of teachers. We built too many schools almost. So if you look at our pupil-teacher ratio, RTE talks about 30:1. We're already nationwide in the low 20s, right? In some states, we're 20:1 even, the southern states, etc. There are some states like Bihar and others where there is a constraint still. So my point is, I don't think it's a resource issue anymore. Yes, incrementally, you'll get some fiscal space because teachers' salary will grow at inflation plus and budget will go at, inflation plus real GDP, nominal GDP, right? So you'll have a little bit of headroom, and we'll be able to invest a little bit more in further massification of secondary, and we'll be able to invest a little bit more in going into pre-primary. Most middle-income countries, their public school system starts typically at age 5 with a pre-primary or a senior K section. And then when you go to upper middle income status, you typically will have a junior K also within government schools. Right? In India, as you know, private schools, even the budget private schools, generally have a junior K and a senior K, right? And then class 1. So I think we need to make that investment over time and massify secondary, because there the GER will improve over time. In terms of digital, I think we need to integrate digital to improve teaching learning. I don't think it's going to save money because it's not going to replace the teacher. The real cost in the education system is salaries. Beyond that, the costs are not that much. And I don't think you can replace the teacher or make the teacher suddenly, if the teacher is teaching 20 children, she can teach 30 because of technology. I don't think we figured that out as yet. So I think the saving, we don't need additional money. Let's remember that. I don't think anybody should have an excuse to say, oh, by the way, the government didn't increase government spend in education to 6% of GDP, and therefore we were not able to meet our objectives. I think that would be wrong. I think even at current levels, say pre-COVID levels, so as we normalize in the next 12 to 18 months, I think this is definitely achievable, is my own view. There are certain things that will take time. So for instance, the policy says pre-primary section in government schools, right? Which is that senior K. I think it'll take 5 to 7 years to do that, because it'll take time to absorb that the fiscal space will get created over time. So it cannot happen all at once, because if you did it all at once, you need a big jump in the budget, which I think is fine. The NEP doesn't say it has to happen overnight. So I think the NEP's objectives can be achieved just with the current sort of spend as a percent of GDP.
And the phrase that I've heard often, it's not just about the quantum of the spend, it's the quality of the spend that matters. That's the catchphrase that I've heard in education space, which neatly segues into, before this session, we also asked our education alumni members if they had a question. And the one that stood out completely was a combination of all the questions, really was about the private sector. Yeah. The private sector. The assumption in the questions, and I know that that is not what the literature says, was that the private sector has enabled quality education much, much more than the government or the public sector has. And in terms of what is visible, the top 1% or the top 10% of the private sector, clearly you have these grand schools in the private sector with excellent results, even as students go abroad across testing, etc. A debatable point, I would say, when one considers the entirety of the evidence. But what I'm also noticing, so one, of course, about the quality of spend in the private sector, the public sector, and the comparison in being able to enable quality in that. And just because it is so troubling, and this is something I hear from budget private sector schools every day, so not the top 10%, is that at this point of time, they are in financial crisis. Yeah. Their fee collection is awfully low. I mean, I have heard numbers as low as 4%, and the best number I have heard is 49%. I have not heard any number. And 49-50% is the schools that are doing really well. Many of them have said by December, we will be out of our working capital and reserves, and by December, we will have to shut down. Yeah. Now, I see this as valuable capacity in the sector. As you said, 1 out of every 2 students goes to the private sector. And if we allow this capacity to die down, I think we would have lost a valuable national resource. So one, are they truly delivering better quality than the private sector, than the public sector? And therefore, should we save them? You can see I want to save them desperately. Or are they delivering capacity? And so should we save them? Or how should we progress with this entire private sector question? And I seek this from you because, again, CSF has just come up with this fantastic private sector report that has a very comprehensive overview of what the private sector does, delivers, is about. Susan.
Yeah, so Meeta, as you alluded to it, we just did this comprehensive report on the private sector. Mm-hmm. And we care about it because, as I said, 1 out of 2 children, goes to private schools. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to remember, it's 120 million children. Yeah. Of its own accord, the private sector in India would be number 3 system in the world. China would, if you disaggregated the Indian system, China would have the number 1 system. The Indian public system would be number 2. The Indian private system would be number 3. It's that large, 120 million children. Also, we have to remember, we generally look at it through our lens. The schools we went to, our children go to, etc. That is not the private sector. What we showed in the report is 70% of children are in schools that charge 1,000 rupees or less per month. 1,000 rupees or less per month. I want to repeat that. And 45% of children go to schools that charge 500 rupees or less per month. So that is the private sector. It's really, and what we looked at is even across the socioeconomic pyramid by quintile, what you see is even in, of course, it's a disproportionate, 58% of the first quintile send their children to private school. But what you see is even in the 3rd quintile and 4th quintile, parents are sending their children to private school. So this is not just an elite phenomenon. And this is the point I think all of us need to remember. And frankly, we will, like we did with FLN, we're going to do a lot of narrative building around this. Because I think what this perception is that private schools are elite, or they are bad actors, basically. They're gundas, and that's not necessarily the case, as we know. In terms of and so why we need to care about this sector is it's played a great role in massification. We may not have achieved this universalization of elementary education if it were not for the private sector. So capacity is one key reason to save the sector. As far as learning outcomes are concerned, the evidence is much more mixed. I think the evidence shows that the learning outcomes are marginally better. And I think it's partly because if you look at private schools, they're operating at a fraction of the cost of the public system. So those private schools I talked about the median private school is at about 600 rupees a month. So 7,000 rupees in fees, all in maybe 10,000 rupees. So it's at less than 50%, right, of the cost per child within the public system. Almost 35-40% of the cost per child within the public system. And yet it delivers slightly better outcomes. So we have to remember. So as per capita income increases, the quality of these schools will improve, because they will be able to hire better quality teachers, put in better quality systems, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one natural trend that you're going to see. The other thing I think we need to look at is the problem with the private sector is you don't have the incentive to improve. Because right now, private schools say we are English medium, we have better accountability, which is true. You can come and you'll be sure the teacher is there. You can come and shout and scream at the principal or the school owner. You have every right to do that. You can't do that in the public system. And so the combination of English, better accountability, there are several reasons, and we have this in the report, in fact. The reasons why parents send, sometimes it's because there's computers, better infrastructure, shiny object, all of that. For those reasons, parents often. What parents don't have a sense of is the learning marker. So what research has shown is the reason the market doesn't work efficiently here is because of information asymmetry. Parent doesn't know whether the school is performing or not. So if I were to be able to solve for that information asymmetry, right, then learning outcomes will improve because the school owner now has an incentive to improve. So one of the reasons we've at least lobbied hard for this class 3, class 5, class 8, quote unquote, census exam or board exam or whatever you call it, is to have this learning marker and then to make it public, not at the child level, but at the school level. So the research shows that if you know where your child's school is and where all the surrounding schools are, because generally the surrounding schools will come from the same socioeconomic or have children from the same socioeconomic milieu. So you're solving for household effects in some way, right? Then you get actually a 0.3 sigma improvement in learning outcomes because the incentive is there now. It's now transparent, right? You can't hide under the cover of English medium or better infrastructure or accountability or what have you. So I think working on this information provision, I think is a very important one if you want to create the incentives for private school owners to perform. I'll also talk a little bit about this issue of COVID that you touched on. I think it fundamentally stems from the fact that we haven't recognized, it's this narrative, that this private sector is not elite. It's not necessarily chori chori, chupke chupke, badmash log, kind of thing. They're doing a service to the country. 1 out of 2 children goes there. So why can't we, and we should be lobbying for this, that why can't this be a priority sector as far as bank lending is concerned? Why can't this be a sector where when we look at an SME bailout, this sector is included? Because this sector has got a body blow. Parents are not willing to pay the fees. So what are these people going to do? How will they pay their teachers? How will they survive? Etc. And if we realize that they're playing a role in providing capacity, even if they're not providing dramatic improved learning outcomes, they're providing choice to parents. There's a reason on that basis alone to say that we should have given them some kind of rescue package. It's interesting, in countries like the UK, NGOs lobbied for a rescue package. And here we have a private school system that was left to fend for itself. So I think those are the points I would make. Yes, the capacity is important. It should remain because it gives parents choice. But if we want improvement in learning outcomes, other than the natural trend of per capita income improving and these people getting richer and moving to better quality schools over time, that shift, I think we need to create the incentives for owners to perform and get rid of this information asymmetry. And so people working on that hypothesis, I think, are likely to achieve results.
That's absolutely, I mean, exactly. I'm just horrified at two things. One, allowing them to flounder without any support. I think even before COVID, the narrative was clearly that these schools are not good enough. At least the budget private schools are not good enough. My response to them would have been, if you're not good enough, let me help you improve. Rather than, if you're not good enough, I'm going to shut you down if you're not registered under XYZ rules. And I mean, that would, anybody would do that in the education space. You know, that's natural. But there is also, and there is an audience question about this. There is also the question of teacher quality, both in the private schools and especially in the private schools. Now, teacher quality is very, very variable. The TET and NET tests again have not given any great results. So I'm going to ask a couple of audience questions right away, Ashish. One about teacher quality and how do you attract good teaching talent? Why are salary levels at the school level not prescribed? I think they are, as far as I know. And the second question I think is more interesting. How do you compare two schools? What are the measurable metrics? So again, teacher quality becomes a subset of that question, really. I'd love to, I'm just bringing in audience questions before I go back to the mainstream.
So I think this teacher quality issue is an important one. I mean, clearly a system is constrained by the quality of its teachers. You know, there's an upper ceiling in terms of how much you can progress based on the quality of your teachers. We are still not at that frontier. So let me say we'll still see a lot of gains to get to that frontier of what our teacher capacity is. So you could argue, yeah, the reason Finland is so great, Singapore is so great, Korea is so great, Vietnam, because teaching is more respectable profession and better, you know, smarter kids go into teaching, they're more mission driven, et cetera, et cetera. But I would argue that even without that, there's a lot of headroom, right? Now, in the longer term, so this is longer term, it won't happen in 3 to 5 years. In the longer term, we do need to focus on pre-service education. We do need to make the profession more mission-oriented, go sell this idea that it's a noble profession to be a teacher. We do need better pre-service education, which is right now, there are these private institutes, mom and pop shops that give you, basically it's a tappa degree. I mean, you can go and buy the degree. So we need to formalize that. And when you go to China, India has 15,000 teacher education institutes that give these tappa degrees, typically owned by politicians or lalas. And if you go to China, there are 100 normal universities where this happens. And each of them is like 4 years. You go to these campuses, it's like a proper university. You know, you want to apply because it's prestigious to get in, right? Versus going to one of these tappa shops to get your tappa. Then you've got the filter, which is the exam. So this TET you were referring to, because to get credentialed to become a teacher, which in most countries in the world is a much better exam. In India, the good news is that part CBSE is now looking at. So I do believe that exam quality will improve. But I think it's going to be a longer journey to get better flow of talent into the system, right? And it'll require a number of building blocks to fall in place before that can happen. And so that's a 20-year journey of, you know, by the time the flow, because, you know, attrition is very low in this space, particularly in the public system, very, very low attrition. So in the near term, it's more about how do you build a better teacher through, you know, some skill building, but also importantly, you know, providing them with the right tools and yet the right support, coaching, but also monitoring and accountability to get them closer to the efficient frontier, even with the current teacher capacity constraints. Your
Second
other question
on metrics, yes.
Yeah,
On
metrics. Yeah, so I mean, I still, obviously, you know, when we have to look at a school, you got to look at it holistically. But I somewhere feel that the most important metric is student learning outcome, because particularly for, you know, the children who we care about, who come from the bottom 2 quartiles of the socioeconomic pyramid, The reason they're being left behind is because we're not even delivering basic foundational numeracy and literacy to them. So if we can achieve just that goal, we would have set them on the path to success, right? That they can now go on, because it's very clear that if you don't achieve that, your learning trajectory flattens. You may progress to class 8 or 10, but you still can't read, right? So we have failed that child. So to me, I think that's still the single most important metric. Can a child read with meaning? Can a child write? And can a child do basic math? On top of that, of course, there is socio-emotional learning. I mean, the socio-emotional is important because we don't want a child who's an automaton, but somebody who's self-aware and who's caring and has all those attributes as well. And you want some degree of school culture and other school level metrics. But to me, the core is still, because I think India will not be able to progress till we don't break through this 55% learning poverty that I said, which World Bank put out, which is 55% of children at age 10, class 5, can't read basic class 3 text. Sri Lanka is at 15%. China is at sub 20%. Our first goal as a country, and therefore for every school, for every principal, for every teacher, for every block official, is to get that 55% down to 25 and 20%. You know, getting to zero will be very hard. Getting every child there will be very, very hard. So to me, that's the most important metric that I would look
at. I always have a more emotional one when people ask me, which school should I select? And one does get that question inevitably, though I have no expertise in personal school selection. And my answer actually is quite ridiculous, silly in a way, but I think incredibly meaningful. And for me, at least. And that is, once you've figured out that the basics are in place, and this, of course, talks to T1 India, not to T2 and T3. Once you've figured out the basics are in place, just stand outside the school and see if the children coming out at the end of the day come out with shining eyes and a jaunty step.
Sure.
And I think the rest of it, you know, because if they've learned, if they've grown personally, if they've engaged with others, they've built collaborations, there has been progress on an everyday basis. They will not come out tired or listless. There is that shine. And I think, as every teacher out here knows, that glint in a student's eyes. I know you spend time in the classroom teaching as well, personally. So that aha moment when the student gets that, I think that's sort of what we passionately live for. And this in a way is the quest for quality, where we can get to those aha moments everywhere. Now, because we are a management school, and this aha moment is in a way jargon from the management sector, because we are from a management school. And I swear this is not about midlife crisis at all. It's not that all of us at our 25th reunion say we want to do something for education. But even before that, there are, and this is why it's a personal question in a way on behalf of all management students and alumni. There comes a point of time when many of us realize that we have been trained in incredible management skills. At least we think they're incredible. We think they're very useful to society, and we should be able to use these skills for society. Many have great marketing skills, finance whizzes, systems managers, they've been CEOs. There's a lot of arts and social and emotional learning that they have engaged in over the years before their management education. People with 20 years experience, I would say truly valuable members of society. And if they want to engage with the education sector, and more specifically in the policy space, how would you think that they can contribute to this space? What value do they bring to the space, and how can they bring? What are the channels for bringing that into our space?
Yeah. So clearly, I'm a management graduate myself, so I'm a little bit biased in that I do believe that our training at management school, but also thereafter in the corporate world, there's a lot that can transfer over into whether it's the policy domain or even getting things done through the system, social sector, etc. At the end of the day, many things are similar, but I think there are some things that are different. At the outset, I think it's, you know, what I have found is that, and this is true of me as well, when I made the transition, most people are quite sort of glib and jump to conclusions very quickly. because all of us have been through schools. All of us have had our children, particularly if we are older, go through schools. We have a lot of biases, a lot of opinions that are formed, frankly, that are not driven by evidence. We don't understand the real nature of the problem. So I would say, first and foremost, we need to be humble. We need to be ready to unlearn. We don't need to be too presumptuous. Go and read the literature, go and understand, take the time. This is a very, very complex problem. This is not one where you'll just sit with your friends over a beer and solve the problem, right? And then go and execute. It's actually coming up with a design for how you'll do system reform is extremely complex. I can promise you it's more complicated than launching a new product in the market, right? There's no doubt about that. And so I would caution management graduates. You said policy space. I find most people have not read the literature. They haven't actually gone and seen what's worked, what hasn't worked in the Indian, so have both practical understanding. They haven't really talked to enough people to learn from them. So I think that's really, really important. I think it's quite dangerous almost to unleash management graduates into the education sector. If they just go and jump in, I almost feel they need to spend some time. And I know Ravi Sridharan, who's an IIMA grad who has set up ISDM, says that, we need to call it development management because it is a different lens through which, and it's a different toolkit that you need to succeed in the development sector. And I think having the greater empathy, greater humility to not only learn, but also to understand, system change, how complex this is, before sort of going whole hog is very, very critical in my mind. But I think if one takes the time to do that and one has the humility, I think there's management graduates will do wonderful work in this sector. I mean, if you look at NGOs that have scaled in the education sector, actually most of them are run by people who've had some corporate experience and have come from management schools. Organizations like Kevalia or Akshay Patra, or many of these organizations have corporate people running them. So I think there's a lot of hope. But I would say that one should be really mission driven, do it for the right reasons, and do it well, as opposed to just jumping in and being glib about it.
Absolutely. I think one of the jokes that I have specifically about our institute is, I have to tell you the story. I know we're almost running out of time, but we had a meeting of IIMA alumni in the Bay Area. We booked half of a restaurant. As soon as the first 5 of us walked in and we said, we need to rearrange the space for ourselves, and completely restructured the way the restaurant was prepared to make its delivery. And all of us tend to do that. We're standing in a queue at a bank or in an airport queue, and we know how to do this better because we've been trained for this. I mean, that's very typical of a management graduate. And I think I completely accept with a great deal of humility that creating education reform is like a surgical intervention. And the first rule should be clearly, first do no harm, because you have no idea of what you are unleashing by simply pulling one thread out of that weave. You have no idea how deep and how multi-generational the impact of that can be. So definitely with you on the humility, definitely with you on do not jump to solutions. And because this has come up 2 or 3 times as part of the audience question, I'm going to add this on now before I hand back to Anish. There are a couple of questions about, has technology actually delivered outcomes? And we have literature to support that question. So that's a fairly easy part of it. But you spoke of management graduates, and you cautioned us again rightly, on not jumping to solutions. And when I look at the edtech space, which is different from the education space, I see them as clearly in distinct areas. I find that the edtech space is very supply side driven. I have seen this problem. I know how to solve it. Here is tech that will come into it. Therefore, let me plunge in and solve the problem. And I honestly have not seen enough engagement in understanding the problem or the pain point, or enough of them being demand-led. They are market-led, not demand-led. And therefore, technology itself, of course, has a role in terms of edtech players. But and I find the valuation game in the edtech space rather inadequately resourced in figuring out what to invest in. It's a very short-term view on what to invest in. And as an investor, I would actually seek your expert views on that. And of course, views on edtech as something that shifts the needle or the impact of education as a tool of technology.
Yeah, so I think on edtech, I would say it's too early to tell. There are positive examples, but remember, even the researchers from JPAL or whoever is doing an RCT, not going to, typically it's the better products. So MindSpark, so Sridhar is an IIMA grad who produced this product called MindSpark out of education initiatives. And we'd actually worked, when I set up Central Square Foundation, these pilots in Delhi in the community that we did, which was evaluated, and stunning results, 0.5, 0.6 sigma improvement, stunning. But the same product, when you put it into the government school system in Rajasthan, and even with more support than a typical rollout at scale would provide, the results were down to like 0.1 sigma improvement. So, and this is a very good product. It's an excellent product, right? We need to focus on how we get it embedded into the system better, because the product fundamentally works. So I think the evidence still isn't, we need more supply in the vernacular, because the supply is still for India one. It's Byju's and Topper and all of these things. Even those products, we don't know if they really work. Who's evaluated them? I mean, they probably help in some supplemental education, right? And they make things a little bit more visual. You can see a beating heart versus just seeing the 2D rendition in your biology book. But we're not sure. Nobody's evaluated to tell us whether it's any better. They're just doing a great job selling and marketing and stuff like that. And of course, there's now the virtual tuition market, which is basically on a platform taking what's offline and bringing it online. Is that much better? I'm not sure. Versus, it is possibly better because it allows the best tutor to be accessible to many, many more students. So I'm hopeful. But I think management graduates and people from the corporate sector tend to be optimistic about the impact of edtech. I think you just have to be patient. We need to do this a little slower than most management graduates would hope for. And I caution you because, take the example of Peru, where MIT went and pushed this Nicolas Negroponte, 1 laptop per child. They rolled it out. Zero impact on learning outcomes. Same in Uruguay. You have to do this right. And so I think we still need better supply, more products that are pedagogically sound, not just developed by techies, but by people who understand education, who understand teachers and people who understand, cognitive science, along with the tech people. So better products, which are really intent to not just market and sell, but also improve learning outcomes. We need more evidence, not just at the product level first, but then even in terms of how it will work at scale in the system. So I still think it's early days. I'm hopeful, but I would just caution by saying that everybody was very bullish on another IIMA graduate who set up EduComp. And this rolled out to thousands of schools across India, Smart Class. And it failed. And it failed not just because commercially it was not successful, schools didn't want it, but because the impact on learning outcomes was a big fat zero. Frankly, it may have been negative because the teacher was just sitting there doing nothing and kids weren't learning. And that time could have been spent, with the teacher actually. It was crowding out the teacher's teaching time. So I just think we have to be careful, is my only point, and do it right as opposed to rushing in. It is not as simple as we think.
And I think the point that you also mentioned but did not emphasize is patience.
Yeah.
It's a slow crawl. In fact, at one point of time, I spoke to a lot of educators and I said, if we were all to write one book together, the title of that book would be, why do you still keep doing this? Yeah. When progress is so slow and so excruciatingly small. But it's literally like moving one ant step at a time, and you know that you want to make that elephant, that behemoth move. And the sheer grind of it all it's not easy. Yeah. It's not easy. It makes you feel very small very often. And yet the sheer largeness of the problem, the grandeur of the problem makes you feel very large at the same time. So just one quick personal note before I hand back to Anish and his questions.
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head. I think as you transition to the social sector, you realize that one is you're one of many, many, many players. I think it's a whole bunch of, one has to have a big tent approach because there's so many people to learn from, so many people whose shoulders you can stand from. If one can, it's very hard to get people, NGOs to work with each other, but I think as a foundation, you can play more of a role in orchestrating because you're not competing with NGOs. I think at a personal level, look, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. I think that I wake up feeling good about what I do. I deeply care about the work. It is my life's work in a sense, and it's the thing I'm most proud of, much more proud of than my investing career. It is very hard. So the way I would say is that you need a lot of patience because changing a system is not easy. There's no running away from it because it's not like, oh, I launched this product, it bombed, let's move on. I mean, you got to stay committed for a long period of time, even if you know that you've not made a difference, in the first 5 years or what have you. So the way I like to say it, the lows are lower because, lows are lower as in, you'll start something in a state and the IS officer will change and boom, things fail. So many things are outside your control. So the lows are lower because it can be very, very frustrating. Or you put in money, time, all this effort and nothing changes, right? But the highs are also higher in that. So I think that's the big difference. And as long as you're mission aligned, you will stay the course because you'll tide over those low points and really focus on the high points and stay focused on the true north, which is really to bring about change over a longer period of time.
Absolutely. I mean, totally resonate with that. Audience question that's come a couple of times, a very easy one for you, is on the language question in the NEP. Inevitably, of course, there's been a lot in the press about it, right, wrong, politicized, whatever. If you would just like to spend a minute or two explaining the language issue, the research behind it, and why it's important.
Yeah. So I think the literature clearly shows that, look, mother tongue it's much easier for a child to learn to read and write in the mother tongue. And that's common sense because it's the oral language that you already acquired in the home, listening and speaking. And so clearly it'll be much easier to learn to read and write in that language. And it's also not artificial. I mean, we know learning a foreign language is so hard because if you go back home and you don't speak that language, it's very hard to make progress in that language because it's an alien language in that sense. So I think mother tongue makes a lot of sense, the research, but also common sense. The real issue is are they going to impinge on choice? If you want to send your child to an English medium school because you believe that's right for your child, a private school, will the system over time say, no, mother tongue education is better? It may be better, but it's a question of supply versus demand. So I don't know. And whether the state will try to regulate this, I think that's the fear people have. I don't think nobody is against the idea of mother tongue. It's the issue of will the state try to dictate what that mother tongue ought to be in a particular school in a given state.
No, I think maybe some people are against the idea of mother tongue earlier and using the same logic as the Heckman curve in the early years, that the sooner we put it in, the sooner we embed this language of economic mobility, the sooner our child is on track for economic
mobility. But we're not saying don't learn English. We're saying learn it as L2 alongside L1.
Exactly.
It's much easier to get L2 once you have a solid footing in L1. Absolutely. And so the idea is you start English in class 1, you learn to read by class 2, class 3, and then quickly you can even switch to English, thereafter in a much more deliberate way. So that's really what the research shows. And
replicated research, fairly strong.
And the truth, Meeta, is in the school system, to be honest, even the teachers don't know English very well. So I mean, you can say you're English medium, but you really can't transact in English. So you'll end up with some version of English or Benglish or whatever it is in that system.
Yeah, so this is what I say. Classrooms are de facto multilingual classrooms anyway. And I wish the NEP, instead of stoking the controversy with this language, it simply said, we will provide the resources for all languages. And the rest is up to the states. This was great. Anish, who is our host here today from campus, would love to bring you in at this stage with your questions, your comments, your views on the conversation so far. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ashish and Meeta. There's hardly any area which I see is not touched by you both in this conversation, and I don't really think that there's more to ask except for a few sort of high-level questions which I, as a teacher myself, often ponder when I walk into a class, and as Meeta was saying, we strive to generate this aha moment in the class. You walk in with an idea that, oh, this is the concept that I want to deliver across the class. And as I walk out of the class, I see that if it's delivered by the gleaming eyes of the students, if it's not, then I know that certain things that it's not gone through. So I will not ask too many questions. In fact, there's no time for also too many questions. But then this is something foundational to me as a teacher, because it's not just the aha moment. After the class, when I walk back, I also think about like what exactly I'm doing here, right? As a teacher, like what am I creating here? Am I creating more cogs in the wheel? Cogs in the bigger machinery? Who can fit in better, who can do the tick-tock chiming better, or am I creating individuals who can live their lives more fully, right? Now I know that in the Indian education system, this is kind of a challenge. We in time of independence, we started with a very low denominator. The challenge was ensuring literacy, people who can sort of transact with the literal world, right? Today, after 70 years, when Ashish is quoting a report saying that there is a learning deficit, World Bank report saying that there is learning poverty. I mean, it seems we are still not moved beyond the transactional, mechanical part of education, which is reading the semantic, the syntax of learning, literacy, the very foundational things, which can be mechanized very easily through technology. Once that foundations are clear, then you start seeing in countries and societies, education has a whole different meaning. It's not about not even about STEM apparently. It's about creating enlightened members of the society. Now you briefly mentioned about, Ashish, high PISA scores in Singapore and Finland and Norway. Now on that metric, because it's all uniform. You have one single number, everybody looks uniform. But if I go and talk to a student, a high school student in Singapore, and ask a few questions about life, and what do they think about the society and themselves, and where should humanity head course, and ask the same question to somebody from Norway, or for that matter, even United States, I'll get completely different answers, right? Some system is generating a bunch of mavericks, people who are going to innovate, going to question the status quo. Whereas on the other hand, you are creating individuals who are, better fitting, cogs in the system. Yeah, they all get same PISA score, but you're talking about two different type of societies that we are going to, get into. Now, NEP is an interesting intervention. It's like, and after several years, I think a couple of decades, we have this very important intervention. Are we again sort of getting bogged down by the very fact that we are starting from a very low denominator? Are we getting too much focused on the trees and missing the woods? Are we not creating? I'm again, as a teacher, I'm wondering, like, what exactly is education in that policy as as creating future. So I want to know, like, these individuals are going to grow up, become citizens. I'll be interacting with them, maybe as an elderly, senior citizen walking in, walking up to a coffee shop. I would like to have a lively conversation with a young bunch of folks who would question me, would question everything, and something more fun. Are we creating that crowd, or are we creating a bunch of robots? I don't know. I mean, looking at NEP, it looks like version 2.0 of more efficiency, pushing the frontier, a lot of management jargon. Just as a devil's advocate question, and again, not much time. We have to wind up quickly. Thank you. If both of your quick thoughts would be really appreciated.
Yeah, Anish, I'll just give you my quick thoughts. I think you're obviously at one of the leading higher ed institutions in the country, and you speak from that perch, I guess. And when I wear my Ashoka University hat, I would say exactly what you're saying. For those children who actually make it through to higher education or even secondary school, do they have this sort of 21st century skills, right, to succeed? And the comparison you made between being an automaton versus being able to think for yourself. I mean, that's the premise on which we set up Ashoka University. I mean, the whole idea of even exposing students to different disciplines, having more of a Socratic method versus a sage on stage in the classroom, or not having just exam-based stuff at the end of the year, which BU has, versus a more holistic assessment, is all based and almost challenging students to question power. I mean, or anything, frankly, is what we would do at Ashoka. But when I look at for the bottom half of our society, to first progress, I think you need some basic building blocks in place. So I don't think it's in our system, frankly, you need both. There's for those, and NEP addresses that. It says for higher education and frankly, even for secondary school. And I'm not saying you wait till secondary school. Obviously, you have to inculcate the joy of learning, socio-emotional skills, character traits in children, even when they're young. But if they can't read, at least today they're shut out from the world of knowledge. Now, maybe tomorrow all knowledge will be video-based and audio-based, and I don't need to read. But at least right now, I can't progress. If I'm a plumber, I can't read a manual and figure out how to make something work better. And frankly, because I haven't been exposed to knowledge going ahead, because at least the knowledge in the school, unless we completely revamp the school system, it's a given the curricular sequence in the school system, that this is a basic gating issue. So that's why my answer would be sort of bipolar, which is we do need what you're talking about, but I think for the bottom half, let's do this first before we worry about these are second order problems for them. For the students who are getting to secondary school and to college, these are first order problems.
Yeah.
Thank you, Meeta. Thank you very much, Ashish. A quick clarification. In fact, you just nailed it on exactly this, the same issue that I wanted to bring out is the issue of two classes, right? Or if I were to rephrase my question, do we need two classes? Can we do the Ashoka pedagogy at the primary school level and get them to read? Do we need like two positions, like from a perch, from a patronizing position, to say that, oh, you know what, you need to learn to read first, and for that, and then you learn to question me or question the system or whatever. So essentially, the question was on the bipolarity of the whole thing itself. I mean, is it a matter of privilege to be able to to go through the Ashoka pedagogy, or is it only happening at a higher education level? Can't it be inculcated right from the?
I agree with you, Anish. It should be in the school system as well. And frankly, just even, I don't think anybody trains teachers to get their students. If you look at go to a typical Indian classroom and you look at student voice, and students have no voice, or even what % of the time students are speaking relative to, just measure that. You'll get the answer will be obvious. And even when they're speaking, they're just responding.
Absolutely.
To the teacher. So I agree with you. I don't think these two are orthogonal to each other. I just think it's a question of prioritization in my mind. That let's achieve this goal at the same time, and they're not orthogonal. You can still teach it when you're doing your teacher training. You can encourage teachers to bring out student voice, to pay attention to that, to make them realize why this is important, that it's their role to get them to question as opposed to being insecure about it. At the same time, they can achieve the goals of numeracy and literacy. I don't doubt what you're saying. But I think that goal of literacy and numeracy, if we fail our children on that count, which is a very measurable goal, it's easy to measure. And I know we shouldn't only pursue what's easy to measure, but because it's easy to measure, I know that 55% has to come down to 20%. I don't want all this creativity and still be stuck at 55%. Then I've got a problem.
Thank you, Ashish. Yeah, Meeta. Yeah.
Now, Anish, my response is very simple, and my response is based on the questions that I have received from teachers and school principals in the past 2 weeks of explaining the NEP.
So let me just interject. We just have a couple of minutes. I would request all of you to sort of wrap it up. Yeah, the webinar will end automatically at 6:30. So, request you to wrap it up.
Right.
Which is why very quickly, I think the NEP recognizes the nature of the assessment. It's the tail that wags the dog. And therefore, it has sought a recasting of the assessment of the exam, and it's hoping not to change people.
Yeah.
You can't change people, you can't change their behaviors. So let's just change the nature of the question. When it comes to teacher training, train teachers in asking better questions, listening, and so on and so forth. It's there.
Thank you. So, I should thank Anurag for disciplining all of us, I guess. We could speak a lot more on this very interesting and passionate topic we are all passionate about. So let me sort of formally thank Ashish, Meeta for taking time out on this weekend evening and enlightening us with their ideas and thoughts. Also, thank you, Alumni Office, for making all the arrangements, and the Alumni SIG group coordinators, Suhail and Akhilesh, are also here. Thank you very much for making this happen. They are kind of, they are the engine kind of driving this initiative. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, all of you. Thank you all the audience for coming in. We will document the major points and the discussion points and the questions, and we will circulate among all of you later on in the next week. Yeah. So thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely wonderful to talk to you again.
Thanks.